life. Our wedding plans were made thinking that we could be married in New York State since we were going to spend the weekend with Ella and George at Schuyler Lake. Now, almost the last day before the wedding, my sister called to say there was a waiting period of 3 days on getting the license. We hastily made plans to be married in Rutland by the Reverend Frank Griffin, pastor of the Methodist Church on Chestnut Avenue. There was no time to hardly notify anyone, and the people of Patch Wegman Company, where I worked, were indignant when they saw the notice in the Rutland Herald and felt I had lied about our plans. After we had made our Rutland plans, Ella and George called to say a waiver of the waiting period in New York State could be obtained. It did seem that the whole affair had been mishandled. In spite of my lack of judgment, the brief honeymoon started happily, and I had no nervous feelings about my choice of a mate. During the ceremony, I felt a sense of peace and contentment. I hope Lester felt the same, and I feel confident that he did. Since we didn't have a car, our best man, Ed Sheldon, had agreed to chauffeur us to Schuyler Lake since he was going on to Syracuse for the weekend. Ella, George, Lester, and I met him the next day to attend the Colgate-Syracuse football game. George had attended Colgate University and Ed attended Syracuse University. Although Ed sat with us, he was cheering for Syracuse. Lester and I had hired an apartment at 58 North Main Street in Rutland, and we went there directly on getting back to Rutland on Sunday, November 18th. When I said goodbye to my aunt the morning of November 16th, 1934, she wept. Although I had some happy days at 16 Roy Street, I felt no sadness that I was leaving. I have many regrets about my immature attitude and the acts of thoughtfulness and inconsideration which were a part of me at that time. Although my aunt was kind to me in many ways, it was necessary for me to share a tiny room with her, including the bed, with little chance for privacy. She had a boarding house, and all the rooms were rented. The lack of privacy was hard to tolerate by a young girl of 17, and I lived there until I was 21 years old and left to be married. I paid $1 a day for board and went to Clarendon weekends. I helped my aunt doing small things like setting table and doing dishes. And I like to think that by bringing my youthfulness into her life, that it helped her to divest her mourning black and often weeping because of the death of her husband, which had occurred not too long before I went to live with her. Some of the male boarders were young and friendly, and although I never dated any of them, I did have a secret crush on one who came for lunch every day. He was already engaged to a very pretty girl, so my longings for a date with him were hopeless. His name was John Canfield, and he was a real gentleman. My mildly retarded uncle lived with Aunt Delia and helped her with cleaning, errands, and so forth. He had been employed at House Gale Company and was laid off during my sojourn at 16 Roy Street. He was a strange little man who swore with most every breath and incredibly nosy about my boyfriend. The three men that I really cared about while living on Roy Street, exclusive of Lester, were Walter Malgrim, who lived across the street with his mother, father, sister, older brother, and notably his twin brother. Also Bert Muzzy, who was a very fine person who asked me to marry him, but I just didn't feel he was the right one for me. Jimmy Condon from Pittsford, a charming Irish boy from a huge family of 10 children, was a great dance partner and loads of fun. I understand he later fathered a family and died very young. We lived at 58 North Main Street for approximately 2 years, and they were happy years. Lester and I were both working, and we had a good relationship with his colleagues at the CCC camp in Shrewsbury. Since Lester could only get to Rutland when the trucks came to bring the CC boys to the movies, or when someone at the camp who had a car could give him a ride, it seemed much like we were still dating. It was always a happy event when I heard him running up the stairs, as he always did, in the evening to have a few hours with me. It was disappointing when I arrived home in the evening It was disappointing when I arrived home of an evening of being out with girlfriends to find he had been there and left a note. I just didn't feel, however, that I could always stay home in hopes that he would come. My memory tells me that we didn't have a phone, at least not at first. Our social life consisted of partying with Lester's colleagues, and since he was at home for 3 weekends out of 4, we often ate dinner on Saturday evening at a downtown restaurant. One of our favorites was Prouse's Restaurant on Center Street near the Paramount Theater, where we went to the movies after dinner. Another favorite place was the dining room of the Bardwell Hotel, where there was a dance area where we could spend some time dancing. The whole evening then cost not over $5. Our best man, Ed Shevlin, often stayed over the weekend with us, and we double dated for the evening out. Lester liked to cook special things, and when peaches and strawberries were in season, he made shortcake, which we shared with whoever was visiting us. The reaction of our parents to our marriage was entirely different. I'd been making my own decisions for a long time, and my parents liked Lester and were supportive, with no disparaging comments. On the other hand, Lester's father and mother were deeply saddened by our rather hasty marriage. Mother Durfee told me afterwards that she wept every day for a week, and when Lester wrote to them of our intentions, his father wrote an impassioned letter begging him not to take such a step. Dad Durfee stated that he had scrimped and saved to get Lester through college, Northeastern University in Boston, and had not carried life insurance. He had hoped that Lester would be able to provide for his mother in the future. As a result of that, early after we were married, Lester signed a term insurance policy for $10,000, making his mother a beneficiary along with me in case of his death. We never dreamed that he would die so young and that I would surely need the money. Mother Durfee generously declined to take her share and turned it over to me since I had 2 children to get through school. In spite of their regrets, we spent our first Christmas in Fairhaven, Mass, and were welcomed affectionately. I loved my in-laws, and in time they loved me. At that time, we could travel from Rutland to New Bedford by train, changing trains in Boston. That Christmas of 1934 was bitterly cold, with the temperatures way below 0. We sat on the train in Rutland for a long time as the cold prevented enough steam to be generated to operate the train. I customarily walked to work on House Street from 58 North Main Street since I could not get a bus all the way. On the extremely cold mornings, I would have frost on my eyebrows and very cold legs. I purchased an extravagant item, then, considered so then, a muskrat fur coat for $145, $25 down, and $10 a month. Gertrude McNamara, Ed Shevlin's current girlfriend, worked for Popular Courier in Rutland, and she helped me decide on the purchase and get fitted properly. My excuse for this extravagant was the fact of the extremely cold weather and the necessity for a warm coat. Those days were perhaps the most carefree of our married life, in spite of the fact that we had little money, no car, and there was no promised permanence of Lester's job in the CCCs. None of our friends were getting married during those lean years. Looking back, I can appreciate how naive and immature we were in those days. A very appropriate remark was made to me by Mrs. Clarence Adams, wife of the president of Patch Wagner Company. Mr. Adams was working for $50 a week as president of the company. Mr. Adams, I said that. I was getting 30 cents an hour for a week's pay of $14.10, 47 hours a week. There was no deduction for Social Security withholding, as they were not in effect then. Anyway, when Mrs. Adams saw my fur coat, she said, "Remember, it is always easier to go up than to come down." I since have realized what she meant. About 6 months after we were married, in the spring of 1935, I had surgery for appendicitis, and a diseased right ovary was also removed. During my hospitalization, I had lots of company. Besides Lester, my girlfriends came, and one night they stayed, and we were doing a lot of giggling, and I got quite excited. It caused some setback, and in the night when I realized I needed a bedpan, I called for the nurse to come. There was only one nurse on the floor anyway. Getting desperate, I jumped out of bed and then realized I wasn't supposed to do that, so I jumped back in. And by the time the nurse came, I had really messed the bed. She was a dear little person, and I felt so bad for her. After my discharge, I went to Clarendon to recuperate at Mother and Daddy's. While there, I had a terrible attack of abdominal pain. It was abominable too. Mother couldn't get my doctor on the phone because the phone was out of order. Finally, my brother Ed rode his bicycle as fast as he could to my Uncle Elmer's on the creek road to use the telephone. The doctor said for me to return to the hospital. I think Lester came to take me, but in the meantime, a hypo needle and morphine was sent to me, and Mother gave me a shot for the pain. When I was moaning and groaning with pain, I remember Ed saying, "She's going to die, I know she's going to die." An entirely different episode occurred during our 2-year stay at 58 North Main Street. We invited our gang of forestry men and wives and girlfriends to come to our apartment for Saturday night party. We were the babes in the group at 24 and 21 years old, and some of the people were in their 40s or older. They were all accustomed to drinking. It was not a bad party, but it got very noisy, and one of the guests spilled hot coffee on her hand, and since there was dancing in the kitchen, the people underneath did not get much sleep. The next day I had to shamefacedly apologize to the other tenants and say it would never happen again. The foresters, so-called, sometimes were required to take turns on duty, approximately once a month for a weekend. This was done along with the 3 Army officers serving their time. On one occasion, Lester brought me to the Shrewsbury to stay with him on the weekend. He told the orderly not to come into his room in the morning to light the fire, as he usually did. I have no idea how the 2 of us could have slept on an army cot. What we were completely unaware of was the fact that it was a strict rule that no women be allowed to stay in the army barracks. This is an example of my husband's naivety. He was completely unaware that we were disobeying rules. The captain in command at that time was Captain Newington from New Bedford, Mass. We played ping pong in the huge rec hall, and Captain Newington was very cordial to us and agreeable during the weekend. This episode caused a lot of merriment among Lester's colleagues, who had to find a place for their wives to stay overnight when they were on duty. The work at the Shrewsbury camp was building a road through the forest from Shrewsbury to Plymouth, a shortcut which is in existence today. Other work was building tent platforms for outdoor picnic areas. Outdoor fireplaces and a picnic lodge was built in that area also. This was not far from the house no longer standing where my mother was born. Lester's co-supervisors that I remember being at Shrewsbury were Norman Marston, superintendent, Ed Sheldon, Pat O'Brien, Ernest Aldrich, Fred Duplass, Joseph Abisher, and Gardner Hopwood. Hopwood's nickname was Hoppy, and Lester was called Durf. During the years 1934 to 1936, my brothers were attending Rutland High School, and they occasionally came up to my apartment to wait for rides home to Clarendon. Any leftovers of pie on weekend cuisine was devoured Monday if Leland and Earl Ingalls came, as they often did. In the summer of 1935, Lester's Uncle Charlie Wardell and Aunt Ada brought Mother and Dad Durfee and Aunt Ella, Mother's twin sister, to visit us. The Wardells were disappointed in our apartment because we couldn't see the mountains looking out the windows. It never occurred to me at the time that we hired the apartment that lack of mountain view was a drawback. We paid $35 a month for rent, including heat, and the offer of some furniture, which we declined. We bought a maple bedroom set, maple kitchenette set, sofa, chair, and table. We had a fairly large kitchen, small living room, bedroom, bath, and small pantry. There was a gas stove and new chest refrigerator there when we moved in. Our landlady was a masseuse who taught nurses at Rutland Hospital how to rub backs. She occupied a large apartment downstairs, and opposite apartment was occupied by a widow and her spinster school teacher. Opposite us on the second floor was a delightful elderly maiden lady, Miss Curtis. Consequently, we were a house full of females, except when Lester was in residence. When Ellen and George came to Clarendon, we joined them for family get-togethers. Their firstborn, Robert, was born in August 1935, and when I saw him, I began to have yearnings to have a child of my own. Toward the end of the year, it did become apparent that I was pregnant. In those days, women did not work all through pregnancy, so I gave notice at Patch Wagner Company that I would be leaving at the end of March 1936. Those months turned out to be the most difficult because I had morning sickness all day. I would go to work every day, but after a few hours I would have to leave because I just couldn't function. It was very embarrassing, as although everybody must have known what was ailing me, we just didn't talk about it. At one point that winter, the bookkeeper, Grace Stebbins, who lived on West Street, suggested I eat breakfast at her apartment after a walk from Main Street. I think that helped, as I began to feel better about the time I left Patch Company. It was particularly difficult as I spent many lovely hours, many lonely hours, on the bathroom floor retching when there was nothing left to retch. I sometimes felt that if I didn't anticipate the future joy of a child, that I would wish to die and end my misery. Also, people were telling me the sickness would soon diminish, and mercifully it did. About this time, we began to think we should buy a second-hand car. Our friends at Shrewsbury had been very kind, on occasion loaning us their cars, and credit especially goes to Joe Abisher, who often on a late Friday night or Saturday AM would leave his car in our driveway for our use all weekend. Since we had a bedroom window opening on the driveway, he would shout, "Hey, Durf, I'm leaving my car for you." His girlfriend had a car. She was hostess at the tap room of the Berwick Hotel. I believe Joe and Agnes were both alcoholics, as they were invariably drunk, and at dances just holding each other up. Anyway, they were very kind and a generous couple, and when Linda was born, they gave Linda a dear little gold locket, which I think she still has. One or two times I remember Lester having too much liquor was when Joe came, gave him a ride home, and they stopped for martinis. Lester made it up the stairs, not running this time, and said, "Oh, Helen, I'm awfully drunk." And he spent the evening on the bathroom floor near the john, and I remember shoving his feet in the door and closing it when my landlady came to the door for some reason. Anyway, we found a two-door Plymouth sedan with only 8,000 miles on it. I believe it cost us around $550. It looked like new. Had been owned by a school teacher who sold it because she was marrying a man with a car. In those days, there were very few families with two cars. Having a car made it possible for us to go to Clarendon and for Lester to come home more often in the evening and go back to camp in the morning. Once I was able to eat again, I ate voraciously and gained a lot of weight. Toward the end of my monthly visits to my doctor, he felt I should have a C-section for various reasons. And mother was a small woman, and of her 5 children, she had 2 12-pound babies. When Leland was born, the delivery was very difficult, and since she was horribly torn in the process, that birth should have been a C-section. With my added weight, it seems that possibly history might repeat itself. The summer of 1906 was a very hot one, and I would restlessly leave the apartment for a few days in Clarendon, and then go back to Rutland for peace and quiet, as I was as it was noisier with my active brothers at home in Clarendon. We attended one of the social events that summer at a nearby lake. It was the wedding reception of Fred Duplass, a co-worker of Lester's. Fred was an older man who had an interesting history. He had, in former years, been coachman for Abe Lincoln's youngest son, Robert, who summered on an estate in Manchester. Fred had become acquainted with an attractive widow in Rutland, and a romantic attachment had developed. I wore my best maternity dress, a navy blue wraparound. My condition was obvious, but I did a lot of giggling afterwards as one of the women guests approached me and said, "I think I guessed your little secret." We were not out of the era where pregnancy was not discussed openly. In the wee hours of August 26, my water broke, and Dr. Hines said, "Bring her to the hospital right away." Fortunately, Lester was at home at the time. Although it had been a hot day, I remember a cool breeze in the elevator at Rutland Hospital, then only 5 minutes from our apartment on Main Street. In the operating room, I remember the doctor shouting at the nurses that they had not sterilized the instruments properly. Linda was born at approximately 3:30 a.m., and I believe it was some time before they brought her to me. When my day nurse brought her to me, the baby yawned, and I saw the big dimple in her cheek, and of course thought that she was beautiful. The days in the hospital were not blissful, as my private room, $7 a day, was next to the labor room, and I was very distressed by the moaning and screaming that was in evidence when expectant mothers were taken by my door. My night nurse was my old friend and schoolmate, Grace Powers, who refused to take any money for caring for me. The methods of treatment in 1936 for a C-section delivery was much different than treatment today. I was not allowed out of bed until the day before going home, several days away. At that time, the doctor decided I didn't have enough milk to nurse the baby, so started a formula of Similac. A chain of errors ensued. We initially misread the formula, and on top of that had nipples that either didn't have big enough holes or were too big, and our new baby cried all night and part of the day as well. As a new mother, I was completely inadequate and frightened. I envy the enjoyment and confidence which my daughters have had with their new babies, and also my grandchildren's enjoyment with their babies. Mother Durfee came to help me when I came home from the hospital, and she really tried to help, and certainly did with meals and so forth. The drawback was that she had been mother to only one child whom she successfully nursed and knew nothing about bottle feeding. In addition to that, she was having menopause symptoms of hot flashes and was really not well enough to be tending to a colicky baby. There was not a pediatrician in Rutland at that time, and we finally wound up with a lady doctor who was taking courses to become a pediatrician. She ordered Linda back to the hospital, and when we visited her there, we found her isolated as she could not go back to the nursery, in a corner of her room with a bottle of horrible-looking lactic acid milk popped up in her mouth, and with no one interested in looking after her. The result of all this was that Lester took his mother back to Massachusetts on Columbus Day holiday, and I went home to Clarendon. Being in a state of nervous exhaustion, the doctor ordered bromide for me, and Mother had Linda in her room to take care of her for a matter of 2 weeks. It didn't help my ego any that my father remarked, "I knew she wouldn't be able to take care of that baby." Well, at the time he was right, but when I took the baby home she had started to thrive, and although I had lost a lot of weight and was pimply from the bromide, I was in better condition to take care of her. Sometime after we purchased the car, during the early spring when roads were still icy, Lester had an accident going up the Coal River Road to Shrewsbury. The car spun out of control on ice and slid over on its top. Miraculously, Lester was not hurt. Sometime towards mid-morning, he came to the apartment to tell me what had happened. The car was quite badly damaged, but could be repaired. It had to be towed to a garage, and was out away for some time. The accident took away much of the joy of having the car, probably due to the hazards involved and the type of damage. Acid had leaked out of the battery and ruined some of the upholstery. In the fall of 1936, Ernest Aldrich and his wife Minnie invited us to be resident caretakers of their farmhouse, which was opposite the road leading to the CCC camp in Shrewsbury. Ernest was working at the CCC camp, but during the winter, they were moving to Montpelier, Vermont, since he was an elected member of the Vermont legislature. They would charge us $5 a month, and we could occupy kitchen, living room, parlor was closed off, and bedroom and bath. This seemed like a good offer to us since the camp was in walking distance from the farmhouse, and Lester could come home for lunch as well as be with us every night. We moved to Shrewsbury around November 1st and lived there until spring. The Aldriches did not have children and were probably pushing 60 years of age at this time. The house was immaculate. The cook stove was an old-fashioned range that shone with a polished appearance of never being used. The ultra-cleanliness frightened me, considering the prospect of keeping everything up to Minnie's standards. Linda had put on weight and was a fat little cherub. Lester was a doting father, but the care of the baby was my job. Certainly he never changed a diaper or bathed the baby, as fathers did not do such things. And I never heard of a father being admitted to the delivery room in a hospital during those years. I doubt if any of the fathers wanted to be there. That winter in Shrewsbury had its drawbacks, and perhaps were least happy of my married life. I had not fully recovered from the trauma of caring for a colicky baby, was anemic, and had back problems. My first experience in the Aldrich house was trying to get lunch when Lester came home with a use of the kitchen range. I just couldn't get enough heat from the wood I put in to heat the stove top or the oven. The first day, lunch wasn't prepared and I was practically in tears. I don't remember what we ate that day. It was explained to me that I had to keep the stove full of wood for some time in the morning to get the desired temperature. We had a range at home when I was growing up, but my mother did the stoking, so my experience was limited. Anyway, I had to learn. In my condition, it was soon apparent that taking care of Linda, doing the baby's laundry by hand, plus the cooking was too much. So we hired a newly married lady to help out mornings. This girl, who was younger than my 23 years, was several months pregnant, but husky and healthy and a willing worker. All that winter we were surrounded by several feet of snow. The clothesline was on the open porch, and when diapers and so forth were hung on the line, they quickly froze and had to be dried on a rack inside. I was told that the freezing helped whiten the clothes. The Aldriches had a huge police dog that had access to the back room and came and went as he pleased. Lester loved dogs and would let him in the house when he came home in the early evening for supper. I never became very good friends with Fritz, as I was a bit scared of him, and especially since he seemed jealous of our attention to the baby. Actually, the dog had two homes, and he traveled back and forth between them. There is a story bandied about among the Shrewsbury people about the Aldrich family. And since the subjects are all dead long since, I guess it's okay for me to relate this old-time gossip. This was told to me at least by three people, different people. Warner Aldrich, Ernest's brother, lived with Ernest and Minnie for many years, and evidently was assumed by Minnie that Warner was a permanent resident of their household. Minnie was in for a shock, as Warner secretly married her widowed sister, and the story goes that Minnie never spoke to either one of them after that. The dog belonged to Warner, so there lies the explanation as to the dog having two homes. So I start another paragraph there.